Most men surrender their mornings after 60. Tragic mistake. Your dawn hours aren't meant for mindless routines and empty leisure. They're the foundation of everything meaningful in your day. Without structure, without purpose, your mornings collapse into wasted potential, and wasted mornings become wasted days, then wasted years. The evidence is clear. How you orchestrate your first waking hours determines your relevance in this world. It's entirely on you to reclaim this critical time. You're being sold a lie, a comfortable, sedating lie that your mornings don't matter anymore now that you've crossed the threshold of 60, that the structured discipline of dawn is something you've earned the right to abandon. This is precisely how men surrender their vitality long before their time. I once visited a monastery in northern Alberta. The monks there, many in their 80s, rose before dawn every single day for 50 years, not when they felt like it, not when it was convenient. Every single day. There was something remarkable about these men, a clarity of thought, a steadiness of purpose that defied their chronological age. What modern men fail to understand is that routine isn't the enemy of freedom, it's the foundation upon which meaningful freedom is built. Your body doesn't care that you're retired. It doesn't recognize your senior discount card. It runs on ancient rhythms tied to the rising and setting of the sun, rhythms that regulate hundreds of processes from hormone production to cellular repair. The tragedy I see repeatedly is men who fought against structured mornings their entire working lives, only to finally gain freedom from the alarm clock, and then squander that freedom in a haze of aimless drifting. There's a bitter irony there. When you consistently wake at the same time, you're not surrendering to a schedule, you're aligning yourself with the fundamental architecture of reality. You're saying to your body, I am still a man of purpose. I am still relevant. My time still matters. An elderly friend once told me how he overcame crushing depression after his wife passed. Every morning, regardless of weather, he would take his coffee onto his back porch to watch the sunrise. Those first rays, he said, they entered my eyes and somehow reached parts of me that grief had sealed off. There's profound wisdom in this simple act that echoes ancient practice. For millennia, humans greeted the dawn, not out of superstition, but because something fundamental happens when morning light enters your eyes. The philosopher Diogenes understood this when he told Alexander the Great to stop blocking his sunlight. It was more valuable than any favor the emperor could bestow. Morning light isn't just illumination, it's information. It tells your body, unequivocally, that a new day has begun. Without this signal, your brain remains in a twilight state, uncertain whether to fully engage or remain in rest mode. The consequences ripple through your entire day, affecting mood, energy, and cognitive capacity. When you step into that first light, you're not just seeing the world, you're allowing the world to rewire your neural pathways in real time. The kitchen table is where many men unknowingly sabotage their day before it begins. I watched my own father transform in his late 60s when he abandoned his lifelong habit of sugary cereals and toast. The change wasn't just physical, though yes, the mid-morning crashes disappeared. It was a fundamental shift in his capacity to engage with life. What you consume in that first hour after waking isn't merely fuel, it's information to your cellular machinery about what kind of day you're preparing for. The soft, processed carbohydrates that dominate most breakfast tables send a signal of comfort, of ease, of backing away from challenge. They speak the language of surrender. When you instead build your morning meal around protein and healthy fats, you're making a declaration to your body, I am preparing for meaningful engagement with the world. I require sustained energy, not a fleeting spike followed by inevitable decline. This isn't about vanity or adhering to some fashionable diet. It's about respecting the biological reality that your aging brain and body require proper nutrition to function at capacity in a world that's increasingly willing to write you off as irrelevant. The empty vessel makes the loudest sound. I'm reminded of this when I see retired men whose minds have become like abandoned gardens, overgrown with the weeds of passive consumption and littered with the debris of half-formed opinions absorbed from talking heads who profit from their outrage. This is no way for a man with decades of wisdom to spend his remaining time on this earth. Implement a dedicated reading ritual. There was a retired surgeon I encountered during a lecture tour. Every morning for 20 years after hanging up his scalpel, he read for precisely 1 hour, not escapist fiction, but challenging material that forced him to grapple with ideas beyond his immediate expertise. "The day I stop feeding my mind," he told me, "is the day I begin to die." What he understood intuitively is something profound about cognitive resilience. Your brain isn't designed for passive retirement, it's designed for active engagement with complexity. The neurological architecture that allowed you to master your profession doesn't simply disappear when you collect your gold watch. It craves continued challenge, continued growth. This isn't about academic pretension. It's about maintaining the neural pathways that define your capacity to navigate an increasingly complex world. When you engage with challenging text in those morning hours, when your prefrontal cortex is most receptive, you're not merely passing time, you're building cognitive reserves that will serve as a bulwark against the encroaching fog that claims so many aging minds. He began modestly, 20 minutes with his coffee, a book propped against the toaster, no distractions, no background noise, just focused attention on ideas that challenged his assumptions. Gradually, the 20 minutes extended as his capacity for sustained attention rebuilt itself. The reward wasn't some abstract sense of virtue, but a concrete experience of mental clarity that carried throughout his day. Practice focused journaling for clarity. The untamed mind is a wilderness of contradictions, half-formed anxieties, and buried insights. I've seen countless men in their 7th and 8th decades walking around with heads full of unexamined thoughts, wisdom that never crystallizes, fears that never resolve, gratitude that never fully registers in consciousness. There was a retired teacher who began each morning with a leather-bound journal and a simple fountain pen. "The act of moving my hand across the page," he explained, "somehow organizes the chaos between my ears. There's something almost alchemical about transferring the ephemeral content of consciousness onto the permanence of the page. The psychological principle at work here is externalization. When thoughts remain trapped in the swirling currents of your mind, they become distorted, amplified, or suppressed. But when you capture them in written form, you create distance, the necessary space between yourself and your thoughts that allows for objective examination." His approach was elegantly simple. 3 questions: what am I grateful for this morning? What challenge am I currently facing? What wisdom from my experience might apply to this challenge? 20 minutes of focused writing, not typing on a screen with its myriad distractions, but the physical act of handwriting that engages different neural pathways and demands presence. Engage in contemplative silence. In a world that bombards aging men with noise, the constant chatter of news cycles, the incessant pinging of devices, the background hum of household machinery, there is revolutionary power in deliberate silence. The capacity to sit quietly with yourself, to face the contents of your own consciousness without distraction, is perhaps the most countercultural act available to the modern man. I remember visiting an old friend, a former executive who had transformed his morning routine after a health scare. "For 40 years, he told me, I filled every waking moment with noise to avoid facing myself. Now I begin each day with 30 minutes of absolute silence. It was terrifying at first, like staring into an abyss. Now it's the foundation of everything else." What he discovered was something the contemplative traditions have known for millennia. Silence isn't empty, it's full of insights that can't emerge amidst noise, full of subtle connections between disparate parts of your experience, full of the quiet voice of intuition that carries decades of accumulated wisdom but speaks only in whispers. His practice began awkwardly, 5 minutes on his back porch, watching the sky without commentary, without judgment, just presence. The impulse to fill that silence was almost overwhelming at first, to reach for the phone, to turn on the radio, to engage in internal dialogue. But gradually, the resistance softened. The silence became not something to endure, but something to sink into, like slipping into a warm bath after a long day of labor. You've been told a devastating lie, that physical decline is inevitable, and that surrender to frailty is the dignified response to aging. This pernicious idea has robbed more men of their vital years than any disease. The body you inhabit at 60 plus isn't a broken machine awaiting disposal. It's a responsive system still capable of remarkable adaptation when provided with the proper demands and recovery. Develop a joint mobility sequence. I visited a community in northern Japan where men in their 90s moved with the fluid grace of individuals decades younger. Each morning before sunrise, they gathered in a local park to perform a series of deliberate movements that addressed every joint in the body. Nothing flashy or strenuous, just intentional motion through available ranges. What these men understood intuitively reflects a profound physiological truth. Your joints require movement to nourish the synovial fluid that prevents degradation. The Western paradigm of taking it easy as you age creates precisely the conditions for accelerated deterioration. Your body responds to demands, not to wishes or intentions. There was a retired construction worker who could barely turn his neck at 67. Years of labor had left him stiff and increasingly limited. He began with embarrassingly simple movements, gentle neck rotations while his coffee brewed, ankle circles while seated at the breakfast table, shoulder rolls while waiting for the toaster, nothing that would impress the Instagram fitness crowd. The transformation wasn't overnight. For weeks he felt foolish performing these elementary movements, but gradually, imperceptibly at first, his range expanded. The creaking diminished. The morning pain that he had attributed to getting old began to recede. 6 months later, he was helping his son build a deck moat, a task that would have been unthinkable before. This isn't about vanity or clinging to youth. It's about reclaiming the fundamental capacity for painless movement that is your birthright as a human being. Your morning mobility sequence needn't be complex. 10 minutes addressing the major joints from your neck to your toes, moving deliberately through whatever range is currently available to you, is sufficient to begin the process of reclamation. Establish progressive resistance training, the withering of muscle tissue with age, sarcopenia, they call it, is not a sentence handed down by biology, it's an invitation to resistance. I remember meeting a retired accountant at a speaking engagement, a slight man who had never been athletic. At 72, he began lifting weights in his garage using nothing more than a simple barbell and some modest plates. I was terrified of looking ridiculous, he confided. A skinny old man pretending to be strong. 2 years later, he deadlifted twice his body weight while his grandchildren cheered. The transformation wasn't merely physical, though yes, his posture straightened, his frame filled out, his grip strength returned. The most profound change was in his relationship to challenge itself. The psychological principle at work here is something more fundamental than motivation. It's about encountering genuine resistance and discovering that you are still capable of adaptation. Every time you successfully lift a weight that would have been impossible months earlier, you're not just building muscle tissue, you're rebuilding your relationship with difficulty itself. His approach was methodical rather than heroic. Twice weekly, he performed basic compound movements, squats, presses, rows, hinges. He began with embarrassingly light weights, focusing on perfect form rather than ego. Each session he added the smallest possible increment, sometimes just a pound. The magic wasn't in any particular workout, but in the accumulated effect of showing up consistently and imposing progressive demands. Implement metabolic conditioning appropriate for seniors. The heart doesn't care how old your driver's license says you are. It responds to demands placed upon it, rebuilding its capacity when pushed appropriately. I'm reminded of a former colleague, a professor who had allowed himself to become breathless climbing a single flight of stairs. At 65, his doctor had given him the standard advice to take it easy, a prescription for accelerated decline, if ever there was one. Instead, he began a simple protocol. 3 mornings a week, he would perform brief intervals of elevated effort followed by recovery. Nothing extreme, walking up his driveway at a pace that elevated his breathing, then recovering until his breathing normalized, repeating this sequence several times. No special equipment, no gym membership, no spandex outfits. What he discovered speaks to a fundamental truth about human physiology. The cardiovascular system maintains its capacity for adaptation throughout life, but it requires the stimulus of intermittent challenge. The comfortable morning stroll that never elevates your breathing or heart rate does little to maintain or rebuild this capacity. His initial efforts were humbling. The driveway that his teenage grandchildren bounded up without notice left him gasping, but he persisted, adding slight inclines, extending intervals by small increments. 6 months later, he joined a hiking group that explored local wilderness areas each weekend, territory that would have been unthinkable half a year earlier. This approach to metabolic conditioning honors the reality of your current capacity while refusing to accept it as fixed or final. The key is finding the appropriate level of challenge enough to stimulate adaptation, but not so much that it overwhelms recovery capacity. For most men over 60, this means brief periods of elevated effort, 20 mice 30 seconds followed by complete recovery, repeated several times within a 10-15 minute window. The modern world has sold you a catastrophic lie about the post-60 years of a man's life, that your value diminishes with each passing year, that your contributions become increasingly irrelevant. That purpose is something for younger men with their careers still ahead of them. This pathological narrative serves no one except those who profit from your disengagement and gradual retreat from meaningful participation in the world. Create a daily contribution plan. I recall a retired engineer who found himself adrift after decades of solving complex problems. Suddenly, he told me, no one needed my solutions anymore. The depression that followed wasn't about missing his paycheck, it was about missing his purpose. Then one morning he made a decision that transformed everything. He created a deliberate plan for daily contribution. What he recognized intuitively connects to something fundamental about human psychology, particularly male psychology. We are built for usefulness, the sense that your actions matter, that your efforts produce something of value to others, isn't some cultural construct to be discarded after a certain age. It's woven into the very architecture of meaning itself. The mistake so many men make is believing that contribution must be grand in scale or formally recognized to matter. His approach was different. Each morning he identified one specific way he could add value to his immediate world. Sometimes it was mentoring a young person in his former field via email. Other days it was applying his problem-solving skills to community issues. Occasionally it was simply fixing something broken for a neighbor who lacked his technical knowledge. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. The fog of purposelessness that had descended upon him began to lift. He moved through his days with the quiet confidence of a man who knows his presence in the world still matters, not because someone paid him, but because he had recommitted to the fundamental contract of contribution that gives life its savor. Structure knowledge transfer activities. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the modern approach to aging is the systematic waste of accumulated wisdom. I'm reminded of a former executive I met who had spent 4 decades building expertise in his industry. Upon retirement, all that knowledge, the hard-won lessons, the pattern recognition, the contextual understanding that only comes with experience, was suddenly shelved, as if it had expired along with his employment contract. What he discovered changed not only his life, but the lives of dozens of younger people in his field. Each morning he dedicated time to what he called deliberate legacy building, structured activities designed to transfer his knowledge to those who could apply it. This wasn't about ego or clinging to past relevance. It was about recognizing that wisdom not passed on is wisdom wasted. There's something psychologically profound that happens when you shift from seeing your knowledge as a personal asset to seeing it as a resource for others. The orientation moves from self to service, from past to future. This shift addresses one of the core existential challenges of aging, the question of what remains when your active career concludes. His method was straightforward. Each morning he documented one specific insight from his career, a lesson learned, a mistake made, a principle discovered, not in the abstract, but through concrete stories that carried both information and meaning. These he shared through mentoring relationships, through writing, through small group discussions with younger people in his field, not haphazardly, but as part of a deliberate morning practice of legacy building. Establish project advancement time blocks. The greatest regret I encounter among men in their later years isn't about career achievements or financial milestones. It's about the personal projects they never made time for, the book unwritten, the workshop unbuilt, the invention undeveloped, the skill unmastered. There's something particularly poignant about a man recognizing that the someday he had counted on for decades has arrived, yet the habit of deferring personal projects remains entrenched. I think of a retired physician who had always wanted to trace his family history and write it for future generations. For years, this project lived in the shadowland of after retirement, yet 6 months after cleaning out his office, not a single word had been written. The tyranny of the urgent had been replaced by the tyranny of the aimless. His mornings, once his most productive hours, had become a wasteland of news consumption and idle browsing. The transformation began when he established what he called a sacred time block, 90 minutes every morning dedicated exclusively to project advancement, not to thinking about the project or planning the project, but to actual execution. This wasn't about inspiration or motivation. It was about the disciplined application of effort towards something that mattered deeply to him. The psychological principle at work here is remarkably simple yet profoundly effective. By placing project advancement in the morning hours, before the world's demands intrude, before willpower depletes, before the day's uncertainties can derail intentions, you leverage your highest cognitive resources for what matters most to you personally. His approach was systematic. He prepared his workspace the night before. He disconnected from all potential distractions. He set a clear, achievable objective for each session. Most importantly, he recognized that progress would come not from sporadic bursts of enthusiasm, but from the accumulated effect of showing up consistently, day after day, and adding to the work already done. The most dangerous epidemic facing men over 60 isn't cardiovascular disease or cancer, it's isolation. The gradual severing of meaningful human connection that occurs as careers end, children disperse, and contemporaries disappear. Society has normalized this profound disconnection as an inevitable part of aging. It is not. It is a modern pathology that must be confronted with the same deliberate intention you once applied to your professional life. Develop meaningful correspondence habits. I think of a retired professor who found himself increasingly isolated after decades of daily interaction with colleagues and students. The abrupt transition from constant intellectual exchange to solitary mornings left a void that television and newspapers couldn't fill. His transformation began with a simple decision. Each morning, he would write one thoughtful letter or email to someone in his life. What he discovered speaks to something fundamental about human connection in the digital age. The shallow, reactive nature of most communication, the quick text, the casual comment on social media, the perfunctory phone call, does little to nourish genuine relatedness. But the deliberate act of organizing your thoughts, considering another person's perspective and crafting language meant specifically for them creates a qualitatively different form of connection. The psychological mechanism at work here is what philosophers call I-thou relating, the recognition of another person as a full subject rather than merely an object in your perceptual field. This form of connection doesn't happen automatically. It requires intention, attention, and the willingness to move beyond superficial exchange into genuine correspondence of minds. His practice began modestly, a few paragraphs to an old colleague, a letter to a grandchild, an email to a former student, not performative writing or attempts at profundity, but authentic sharing coupled with genuine curiosity about the other's experience. Over time, these morning missives transformed from obligation to anticipation. The responses he received became a source of ongoing dialogue that reconnected him to the wider world of ideas and relationships. Practice perspective renewal techniques. The narrowing of perspective is one of the most insidious aspects of aging. I've watched men who once commanded broad vision gradually contract their view until they saw only the immediate, the familiar, the comfortable. This constriction isn't just psychological, it's neurological. The brain naturally prunes away neural connections that go unused. The tragedy is that most men surrender to this narrowing without resistance. I recall a retired military officer who recognized this pattern in himself. His world had shrunk to the confines of his home, his television, and the familiar routines that required minimal engagement with novelty or challenge. His mornings had become exercises in reinforcing existing patterns rather than expanding possibilities. Then he instituted what he called his dawn patrol, a deliberate practice of perspective renewal. What he intuitively understood connects to something fundamental about cognitive maintenance. Your perspective, the lens through which you perceive and interpret the world, requires regular cleaning and adjustment. Without deliberate intervention, it accumulates the dust of habitual thinking, the smudges of unexamined assumptions, and gradually distorts your perception of reality itself. His practice was elegantly simple. Each morning he exposed himself to one perspective fundamentally different from his own. Sometimes this meant reading an author whose political views opposed his. Other mornings he studied an artistic tradition from a culture he knew little about. Occasionally he simply sat in a different place in his home, literally changing his physical perspective on his familiar surroundings. The common thread was deliberate engagement with viewpoints or angles that challenged his established patterns of perception. Implement legacy-building activities. Perhaps the most profound morning transformation I've witnessed came from a retired business owner who found himself increasingly preoccupied with his own mortality, not in a morbid sense, but in the growing awareness that his time was finite and that something of value might be lost when he was gone. His anxiety wasn't about being remembered, but about whether anything of genuine worth would outlast his physical presence. His solution speaks to something universal in the human experience, the desire for transcendence, not in some mystical sense, but in the very practical sense of extending positive influence beyond your immediate circumstances and beyond your limited lifespan. This desire isn't vanity, it's a healthy recognition that you are part of something larger than yourself, a story that precedes you and will continue after you're gone. The psychological principle here relates to what philosophers call generativity, the concern for establishing and guiding the next generation. This isn't limited to your biological offspring. It encompasses any contribution that enriches the lives of those who will inhabit the world when you no longer do. Without this sense of generative contribution, men often fall into stagnation or despair, particularly as they confront the reality of limited remaining time. His morning practice was concrete rather than abstract. Each day he dedicated the first productive hour to activities that would outlast him, documenting family stories for future generations, mentoring young people in his former field, contributing his expertise to community organizations with long-term missions. Sometimes it meant working on a book distilling lessons from his business experience. Other mornings it involved teaching a skill to his grandchildren that they couldn't learn elsewhere. What transformed was not just how he spent his mornings, but his relationship to time itself. The anxiety about mortality didn't disappear, but it was tempered by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that something valuable would continue. His mornings were no longer just another day ticked off a dwindling calendar, but investments in a future he would influence but not see, the very definition of meaningful transcendence. Your mornings are not neutral territory. They're the battlefield where meaning confronts nihilism, where purpose wages war against drift. Every sunrise presents you with a fundamental choice: to build structure in the face of entropy, or to surrender to the comfortable chaos of aimless existence. And make no mistake, it is chaos, regardless of how familiar or comfortable it feels. What I've described isn't merely a productivity hack or a self-help strategy. It's an existential position on what it means to be a man in the final chapters of life. The morning rituals you establish are not just about filling hours. They're about declaring your continued relevance in a world eager to write you off. They're about constructing a bulwark against the flood of meaninglessness that threatens to drown the unprepared mind. The alternative is stark. I've seen it in the hollow eyes of men who wake without purpose, who drift through their remaining days as passive observers rather than active participants. Their suffering isn't dramatic, it's worse than that. It's a quiet desperation, a gradual dimming of the human spirit until nothing remains but biological processes awaiting their inevitable conclusion. Ask yourself this: when you open your eyes tomorrow morning, will you be merely continuing your existence, or will you be consciously crafting your life? There is dignity in choosing the harder path, dignity that transforms the burden of aging into the privilege of elderhood. The choice is entirely yours, but know this: the quality of your remaining years hinges on the decision you make in the first moments of tomorrow morning.